Hey guys, tonight we begin with a cave that is supposed to be warm because it lies inside a volcanic landscape. Frost whitens the sage outside. Cold air settles over Tule Lake. A family steps beneath black basalt, and the title seems to explain itself. Old volcano, underground shelter, free heat. It is a wonderfully tidy idea. It is also where we need to slow down, because the real Modoc story is more interesting than a naturally heated cave, and far less convenient. The lava beds of Northern California contain hundreds of caves, many formed when the outer surface of a lava flow cooled while molten rock continued moving beneath it. But ancient lava is not a stove left on for later generations. Some caves in this landscape are distinctly cold. A few preserve ice or winter icicles. What the rock could offer was usually something quieter: protection from wind, concealment, a roof that did not blow away, and temperatures that changed more slowly than the open air. That is, thermal shelter, not necessarily geothermal heating. History has once again taken a useful fact and tried to give it central heating. If you enjoy calm history where one word can turn a practical shelter into a geological luxury apartment, you can like the video, subscribe, and comment with the coldest place you have ever tried to sleep. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. To enter this world properly, begin near the lakes rather than deep inside a cave. The ancestral Modoc homeland crossed what is now the California-Oregon border and included Tule Lake, Lower Klamath Lake, Clear Lake, Lost River, and the volcanic country surrounding them. Families followed a seasonal round. Warmer months drew people towards fishing places, gathering grounds, hunting areas, and temporary camps. Autumn brought food back toward more permanent winter villages beside lakes and rivers. There, the documented centre of cold season family life was the lodge. Modoc people used several dwelling forms. The most protective was an earth lodge, dug partly into the ground, framed with juniper or pine poles, and covered with earth and woven tule mats. A ceiling entrance could be reached by ladder. Mat lodges were also partly excavated, while smaller wickiups stood above ground beneath tule coverings. These were not accidental piles of material. Earth, reeds, wood, floor depth, entrance position, and fire all worked together. The house borrowed stability from the ground, then added layers that slowed heat loss. That distinction matters because a shallow underground room can feel warm without producing heat of its own. When frost grips the open basin, the exposed air loses warmth quickly. Wind presses through loose clothing and steals heat from skin. A partly buried lodge removes much of that moving air. The surrounding soil changes temperature slowly. A small fire, warm bodies, fur robes, and sleeping mats then have a better chance of making a difference. The ground does not behave like a furnace. It behaves like a patient wall. Now imagine the labour hidden inside that patient wall. Poles must be selected and carried. Tule reeds must be cut, dried, bundled, and woven. Earth must be moved. Old structures need repair before severe storms arrive. Bedding must be kept away from damp ground. Fuel has to be gathered before darkness and bad weather make the task harder. The phrase, "families stayed warm," can sound almost effortless until someone has to lift every piece of the sentence. Women carried much of the work of plant gathering and preparation, and domestic survival depended heavily on materials taken from wetlands. Tule could become mats, baskets, footwear, boats, and parts of houses. Men hunted and fished, while the distribution of daily tasks varied with age, health, circumstance, and household need. Children learned by participating. Older people repaired tools and passed on knowledge. Warmth was therefore not one invention. It was a chain of seasonal timing, material skill, stored food, household cooperation, and attention to people who cooled fastest. So where do the volcanic caves belong? They belong first as known places within a deeply familiar landscape. Caves and lava formations could provide temporary refuge, storage possibilities, spiritual significance, concealment, or shelter in exceptional conditions. During the Modoc War of 1872 and 1873, roughly 150 Modoc men, women, and children lived for months in the natural lava fortress later called Captain Jack's Stronghold, including through harsh winter weather. Small caves, trenches, broken rock, an intimate knowledge of the terrain made the position defensible. Yet wartime refuge should not be quietly transformed into the ordinary winter housing of every earlier Modoc family. This is one of the most useful cautions in everyday history. Evidence that people survived in caves during crisis does not automatically prove that caves were their preferred family homes during peace. A place chosen while an army surrounds you is answering a different question. It may be difficult, smoky, cramped, damp, sharp underfoot, and still better than the alternatives. Shelter is always relative. A basalt opening can be miserable and life-saving at exactly the same time. The word geothermal creates another problem. In strict use, geothermal heat comes from the Earth's internal warmth, often visible through hot springs, steam, or unusually heated ground. The lava tubes at lava beds are the cooled remains of old eruptions. Their useful winter qualities came largely from enclosure and thermal moderation, not from active volcanic heat rising conveniently beneath sleeping families. Some caves could even trap cold air, which is why modern visitors find ice deep inside parts of the monument. Pick the wrong chamber, and your brilliant volcanic heating plan becomes a very dark refrigerator. A knowledgeable family would therefore have judged a shelter by conditions, not by the dramatic fact that it was volcanic. Where was the entrance facing? Did wind drive into it? Did cold air sink and collect inside? Was the floor dry enough for mats? Could smoke escape? Was fuel close? Could children and older relatives move safely across rough stone? Was water accessible without a dangerous journey? Those questions are not preserved for every site, and we should not invent neat answers. But they reveal the practical intelligence required to turn any natural opening into usable shelter. Even a good cave would not cancel the need for insulation. A person lying directly on cold stone loses body heat into the surface beneath them. Mats, hides, robes, dry plant material, and separation from bare rock matter because the floor is part of the weather. Fire helps, but flame inside an enclosed space brings smoke and demands ventilation. Open the shelter too much and warmth escapes. Close it badly and breathing becomes unpleasant or dangerous. The family is not simply receiving heat. It is managing air. That is the deeper doorway into Modoc winter survival. The important resource was not a secret volcanic radiator. It was the ability to recognize small differences in land, wind, soil, water, vegetation, and stone, then combine them with built shelter and household labor. The cave, when useful, was one tool within that larger system. The earth lodge was another, and usually the better documented winter home. Outside, frost could turn the basin pale before sunrise. Inside a lodge, the cold still existed, but it arrived more slowly. Near a lava opening, the same rule applied with greater uncertainty. The rock might block the wind, or it might hold a pool of colder air. Survival began by noticing which kind of darkness you had entered, and whether the thin white line of frost stopped at the threshold or quietly followed you in. And sometimes the frost did follow. Cold air is heavy, and in a cave with a low entrance or a descending passage, it can slide downward and remain there long after the surface has begun to warm. A person stepping into such a place might feel the first few yards becoming colder rather than safer. The entrance blocks the wind, but a deeper floor may hold yesterday's winter like water in a basin. That is the first quiet lesson of volcanic shelter. Underground does not automatically mean warm. It means different. The lava beds are full of those differences. One tube may have a broad mouth, a high ceiling, and two openings that allow air to move through. Another may descend into a chamber where cold collects. A collapsed roof can admit sunlight, snow, or rain. A narrow passage can reduce wind but make movement difficult. Loose basalt can turn every step into a problem, especially while carrying food, bedding, a child, or a bundle of fuel. Even today, park warnings emphasize cold interiors, uneven floors, low ceilings, and sudden drops. Skull Cave keeps a year-round ice floor at its bottom, while Hepper Ice Cave may hold an ice floor in winter. The volcanic ground is clearly capable of preserving cold with impressive dedication. For a Modoc family, then, choosing shelter required memory. Someone had to know which openings stayed dry after a storm, which route could be crossed safely in darkness, and which chamber made breathing difficult. Knowledge may have been passed through ordinary remarks rather than formal instruction. Do not sleep below that slope. Keep the youngest away from that crack. Place the mats here, and leave the entrance clear. The exact words are lost, and we should not invent them. Repeated use still creates practical maps made from experience rather than ink. That memory began outside the caves. Modoc life was organized around waterways, seasonal foods, and semi-permanent villages near lakes and rivers. Tule Lake and the surrounding wetlands provided fish, waterfowl, edible plants, reeds, and travel routes. The ground chosen for a village had to support far more than one cold night. It needed access to water and food, space for lodges, workable paths, and materials for repair. A cave might solve one problem while creating 5 more. History's usual price for free accommodation. A winter lodge offered greater control. The floor was dug partly below the surface. Juniper or pine poles formed the frame. Earth and woven tule mats covered the structure. In an earth lodge, the entrance came through the ceiling, with a ladder descending to the interior. That arrangement reduced the broad, open doorway through which wind could rush. The household gathered around a central fire. The fire still needed ventilation, but the building made cold easier to manage. Picture the floor at night. Mats lie between sleeping bodies and the packed earth. Fur robes provide winter covering. A fire has burned down from flame to a red, controlled glow. Near the centre, the air is warmer. Near the wall, it is cooler. Someone sleeping close to the entrance feels each disturbance above as a thread of cold. Someone must tend the coals carefully, because a large fire consumes fuel quickly and makes the room hard to breathe. Comfort is measured in small adjustments. A mat shifted away from dampness. A robe pulled over a child. An ember moved beneath ash so it survives until morning. The lodge's warmth depended on the household long before anyone lay down. Tule reeds had to be gathered when they were available, processed and woven. Poles had to be cut and transported. Earth coverings could settle or erode and needed attention. Fuel had to be stored where frost or wet weather would not make it useless. Food gathered during the seasonal round had to last through periods when fishing, hunting, or plant collection became more difficult. Its winter warmth began months before the cold arrived. This also changes the image of family shelter. Successful shelter was collective. not one clever person discovering warmer ground. Women faced heavy daily work demands and played central roles in processing plant materials and maintaining domestic life. Men's hunting and fishing mattered, but neither meat nor fish repaired a mat by itself. Children were drawn into useful work as they learned. Older people carried knowledge of places, seasons, and materials, even when their bodies required more protection from cold. A lodge held a family because the family continually held the lodge together. The same social logic would follow people into any temporary rock shelter. The driest sleeping place existed because someone tested the floor, moved stones, carried mats, and watched where water ran. A protected cave mouth could reduce exposure, yet warmth still came from labour brought into it. Firewood did not grow in the chamber. Bedding did not arrange itself. The fumes did not politely choose the correct crack in the ceiling. Natural shelter becomes human shelter through work. Fire inside a cave also behaves differently from fire inside a built lodge. In a lodge, the opening, roof, and central hearth belong to a planned relationship, even if conditions are never perfect. A cave ceiling may trap a dirty haze in a low pocket. A cross draft may pull the flame sideways. Damp walls can make the air feel raw. The safest sleeping area may be far from the fire, while the warmest may have the worst air. Move closer and your eyes sting. Move farther away and the stone begins collecting your body heat, as if it has been waiting all evening. A family could reduce some of these problems by choosing the outer portion of a cave or a shallow rock shelter rather than the deepest chamber. Near the entrance, daylight lasts longer. Heated air has a clearer path, and escape is easier if rock falls or danger approaches. But the entrance is also where outside air arrives. Mats, brush, hides, or other barriers may have helped modify a temporary shelter in some circumstances, though evidence for the exact arrangement at any particular Modoc cave is uneven. Rather than inventing a perfect room, we should recognize the decisions any occupation required. Those decisions included more than temperature. Caves could hold animals, insects, loose stone, and hidden drops. Water might be close in the lake country, but awkward to carry across jagged lava. A person injured on broken basalt loses more than comfort. The household loses labour. An older relative who cannot climb easily changes which shelter is practical. A small child changes it again. The best refuge for warriors defending a narrow approach may be an exhausting place for daily family life. Landscape knowledge meant understanding those differences. Even the entrance of a built dwelling carried meaning. The Modoc Mat Lodge traditionally had an entrance on the east-facing side, while the west was associated with the land of the dead. A doorway could therefore respond to belief, orientation, weather, and social practice at once. Shelter was never only a calculation of degrees. A home also had to fit the human world. By late evening, frost might harden the ground outside both lodge and cave. In the lodge, warmth rose with the fire's exhaust and escaped slowly above. In the cave, cold might settle into a lower hollow, while a protected ledge remained tolerable. Neither place defeated winter. Each rearranged it. The difference between suffering and rest could lie in a few feet of elevation, one dry mat, a protected ember, and the remembered warning that the darkest chamber was not always the kindest one. That warning mattered because warmth was never decided by walls alone. A shelter could be dry, protected, and carefully chosen, yet still fail if the people inside it entered winter without enough fuel or food. The body makes its own heat, but only while it has energy to spend. A person who is hungry, exhausted, wet, or ill loses the contest much faster. In Modoc country, the cold season therefore began long before the first white frost appeared on the ground. During the warmer parts of the year, families moved through a homeland shaped by water. Fish ran through rivers and gathered in lakes. Waterfowl arrived in great numbers. Edible roots, bulbs, seeds and berries became available at different times and in different places. Wokus, the yellow pond lily that grew in the wetlands, produced seeds that could be processed into meal or flour. Tule reeds supplied material for houses, mats, baskets, footwear and boats. Each resource had its own season, and missing that season could be felt months later beside a winter fire. This annual movement was not wandering without plan. It was a calendar written across the land. A lakeshore might be useful for one food, a river channel for another, and upland country for hunting. Families had to reach these places at the right moment, gather what they could use without destroying the next season's supply, and carry or prepare enough for periods when frost narrowed their choices. The work demanded knowledge of weather, growth, animal movement, water levels, and the limits of human backs. Nature provided generously in some years, but it did not offer home delivery. Food became part of the heating system because calories became body warmth. A fur robe slowed the escape of heat, and an earth-covered lodge reduced exposure. But neither could create energy in a person who had eaten too little. Fish, game, seeds, and other stored foods supported more than hunger. They allowed people to repair shelters, gather wood, carry water, care for children, and remain alert when storms or illness made every task heavier. Winter comfort was therefore tied to the success of spring, summer, and autumn work. Storage added another layer of pressure. Food had to remain usable through dampness, animals, insects, and changing temperature. It had to be protected without being forgotten, and divided without knowing exactly how long difficult weather might last. A household that consumed its stores too quickly could face hunger later. One that guarded them too strictly could weaken people who needed strength immediately. There was no tidy label showing the correct winter portion. Judgment lived in daily decisions made around actual bodies. The youngest children could not simply be assigned the same share of cold as everyone else. Older relatives might carry knowledge essential to the household while having less physical resistance to long exposure. A sick person required warmth and food while contributing less labor for a time. Adults doing the hardest work needed energy, but the people least able to gather fuel might need the fire most. The household's heat budget was also a social budget. And fairness could not always mean equality. Fuel created its own arithmetic. A fire large enough to warm a poorly protected space could consume wood at a punishing rate. Every armful represented time outside, distance travelled, and energy spent. Wood gathered wet might smoke badly. Small branches burned quickly. Larger pieces lasted longer, but were harder to cut, move, and arrange. In open country, where useful fuel was scattered, the fire could not be treated as an endless orange decoration. It was stored labour turning slowly into heat. Inside an earth lodge, this made the central hearth a place of constant judgment. Feed it too little, and the room cooled before morning. Feed it too much, and smoke or excessive heat made sleep difficult, while valuable fuel disappeared. Let it burn openly all night, and someone might need to remain attentive. Bank the coals beneath ash, and a small living core could survive until dawn. The surviving record does not give us a complete Modoc instruction manual for every winter hearth. But the physical problem is plain. Flame had to be managed, not merely admired. A cave complicated the same problem. Stone does not burn, which sounds helpful until the smoke refuses to leave. A fire near the entrance may ventilate better, but lose much of its warmth to the open air. A fire deeper inside may warm a small area while filling the chamber above with smoke. Soot on rock can show that humans used fire in caves, but it does not always tell us who was present, in which season. For how long? Or for what purpose? Archaeology can preserve a blackened ceiling more easily than it preserves a tired person deciding to move the bedding. That gap matters. Popular stories like to turn one trace of fire into a complete domestic scene: family, supper, sleeping children, and a comfortably heated cave. The evidence is rarely so generous. A hearth may belong to a shortstop, a ceremony, food preparation, refuge, defense, or repeated visits separated by years. Different people may have used the same place for different reasons. A careful history keeps the warmth of the scene while refusing to make the shadows speak too clearly. What we can say is that Modoc families understood both built and natural shelter as parts of a wider landscape. They did not need a modern thermometer to notice where frost remained longest, where wind struck hardest, or where the ground stayed damp. Observation repeated across generations could identify useful microclimates: the protected side of a rise, a partially buried floor, a stand of vegetation that broke the wind, or a shallow rock opening that stayed drier than the basin outside. The technology was often an arrangement of small advantages. Those advantages multiplied when materials were layered. Earth over a lodge slowed temperature change. Tule mats interrupted drafts and separated bodies from colder surfaces. Fur robes trapped air close to the skin. Dry bedding reduced heat lost into the ground. A central fire added warmth, light, and a place to prepare food. No single element was miraculous. Together they created a room in which the night became manageable. The same principle explains why the title's promise of geothermal heat is both tempting and misleading. The volcanic landscape mattered, but it mattered through shape, stone, elevation, and knowledge more often than through heat rising from below. The old lava flows created tubes, cracks, walls, and sheltered pockets. Modoc experience determined which of those features helped and which merely looked impressive. Geology supplied the possibilities. Families supplied the system. And that system had to survive interruption. A sudden storm could delay gathering. Illness could reduce the number of people able to work. Conflict could force a household away from its prepared lodge and stored materials. Later, colonial violence and forced removal would attack the seasonal cycle itself, cutting people off from places where food, fuel, reeds, and memory were joined. Once that cycle was broken, cold became more than weather. It became the physical result of losing access to a homeland's calendar. Before that larger disruption enters the story, hold for a moment beside the winter hearth. A child sleeps beneath a fur robe. Someone lifts ash gently to find whether the coals are still alive. Outside, frost settles over the tule marsh. The lodge remains warmer because summer seeds were gathered, autumn mats were repaired, and wood was carried before dark. The fire at the centre is small. The season behind it is enormous. The enormous season was waiting when the first person climbed toward the roof opening. Before sunrise, the lodge floor remained dim, and the difference between sleeping warmth and morning cold could be measured in one lifted robe. Near the hearth, ash covered the last coals. Higher up, cold air entered through the opening and met smoke rising from below. Whoever reached the ladder first had to leave the pocket of shared warmth, put hands and feet back into winter, and discover what the night had done outside. A thin crust of frost might cover the village ground, while tule stems at the water's edge stood pale and stiff. On clear, still nights, cold air settled over the basin. The buried lodge floor and earthen covering delayed its arrival, but anyone emerging through the ceiling entrance received the full report. Winter clothing helped. though surviving descriptions remain broad. Fur robes were used for warmth, and tule could become footwear. A robe trapped air close to the body, but it worked best when dry and when the wearer had eaten enough to generate heat. Damp feet could turn insulation into a cold sponge. The rule was endlessly inconvenient. Keep warm things dry. That was difficult beside lakes and marshes. Water sustained the Modoc seasonal world, but winter brought mud, mist, damp materials, and the need to fetch it. The wetlands supplying fish, wokus, waterfowl, tule, and transport also demanded care over bedding and clothing. Inside the lodge, smoke became part of that attention. A small fire warmed the central space and helped dry objects placed near it. Too close and a mat could scorch, or a robe could collect sparks. Too far away, and dampness remained. Smoke leaving through the roof opening might also preserve or dry certain materials, but it irritated eyes and settled into hair, clothing, and walls. There was no button marked fresh air. Ventilation meant allowing some of the warmth you had worked for to escape. Morning food turned the remaining coals back into useful heat. Wokus seed meal, fish, meat, or other stores could be prepared according to what the household possessed. We cannot reconstruct one universal Modoc breakfast. Surviving records name resources more readily than domestic meals. Still, cooking and warmth clearly met at the hearth. One fire could heat food, warm hands, dry a damp object, provide light, and preserve an ember for later. A modern kitchen uses several appliances for this. The lodge gave the entire job to one carefully supervised patch of flame. Children learned the winter routine by being near it. National Park Service accounts describe Modoc parents involving children in work and using praise as an important form of encouragement. A small task could therefore carry practical and social meaning at once. Bringing a light bundle, watching a younger child, helping with materials, or learning which objects belonged near the fire. The exact duties changed with age, household, and circumstance. The larger pattern was participation. Winter knowledge entered the next generation through repeated useful acts. Adults also had to decide who could leave the lodge and who should remain near the warmth. A strong person might handle fuel or water more easily, but repeated trips outside drained energy. Someone caring for an ill relative could lose sleep while staying beside the hearth. A parent might give the driest place to a child and accept the colder edge of the room. These decisions rarely appear in official records because they produced no treaty, battle, or government report. They produced survival, which archives often treat as if it happened by itself. A temporary cave shelter magnified every choice. There was no prepared roof opening positioned for a central fire, no carefully maintained earthen wall, and no familiar floor arranged over years of use. Light weakened quickly beyond the entrance. Rough basalt complicated movement. A family arriving during sudden frost would first need to identify a dry, level area and determine whether air was moving through the tube or settling into it. Before anyone could rest, the cave had to be read. Reading it began at the skin. Did the hands feel colder while moving inward? Did breath linger visibly? Was moisture beading on rock? Did smoke drift toward the entrance or fold back into the chamber? Was there loose stone above the chosen place? Modern park guidance warns that lava beds caves may be cold and can contain low ceilings, uneven footing, steep sections, and deep drop-offs. Those hazards do not tell us exactly how Modoc families used a given cave, but they show why intimate local knowledge mattered more than the general idea of underground shelter. A shallow recess could sometimes be more useful than a dramatic deep chamber. It might stop direct wind while preserving daylight and an easy route outside. A wall of basalt exposed to daytime sun could release some stored warmth after sunset, though the effect would depend on weather, orientation, and the mass of the rock. Deeper passages changed temperature more slowly, but some also collected cold air or retained ice. There was no single cave climate. Each opening made its own bargain. The bargain changed with the number of people inside. More bodies produced more heat, but they also required more space, air, bedding, food, and water. A narrow, protected area that suited 2 travelers might become smoky and crowded for a household. Children needed room away from flame and dangerous drops. Older people required safer footing. A shelter that seemed efficient could fail once knees, sleeping positions, baskets, robes, and firewood entered it. Human anatomy has ruined many elegant plans. Even silence had practical value. From inside a cave mouth, sounds from the open landscape could arrive before whatever made them became visible. Wind in brush, movement over loose lava, waterfowl, animals, or approaching people could alter the night's decisions. During ordinary seasonal life, that awareness might protect stored food or warn of weather. During conflict, it became more serious. The same broken volcanic terrain that complicated family comfort could make movement difficult for an outsider who did not know its passages. Yet refuge remained different from home. A home held repaired mats, known sleeping places, stored food, familiar smoke paths, and relationships with neighbouring households. A cave offered what the moment allowed. Sometimes that was concealment, sometimes a roof, sometimes a pocket of air less brutal than the open frost. Its value did not come from being naturally warm. It came from reducing one danger enough that human work could manage the rest. By full morning, the lodge fire had brightened again. Dampness near the hearth began to lift. Footwear waited where heat could reach it without burning it. Outside, sunlight touched the frost but did not immediately erase the cold pooled over the basin. The family's warmth had survived because no single part of the system had been asked to do everything. Earth slowed the cold. Mats separated bodies from the floor. Robes held warm air. Food fed the body. Fire added heat. Memory decided where each piece belonged, and somewhere beyond the village, a dark lava opening waited in the rock. It was neither furnace nor failure. Under the right conditions, it could interrupt the wind, hide a flame, and give exhausted people time. Under the wrong ones, it could preserve winter more faithfully than the open ground. The difference was not written on the entrance. It had to be felt, remembered, and taught before the frost returned. It had to be taught before the frost returned. Because a warning remembered by one person could become warmth for an entire household. The useful lesson might concern a cave that trapped cold, a slope that stayed dry, a patch of tule ready for cutting, or a stand of wood worth visiting before snow made the route harder. None of this knowledge floated above daily life as a collection of interesting facts. It lived in who walked where, who watched the weather, who carried which bundle, and who noticed that a child had stopped shivering. The labour behind warmth was divided, but it should not be drawn with lines so rigid that real families disappear. Ethnographic accounts often describe Modoc women gathering and processing plant foods, preparing hides, weaving mats and baskets, and carrying much of the work that sustained the lodge. Men are commonly associated with hunting, fishing, defence, and the making or repair of certain tools. Children learned through participation, while older people contributed skill, memory, and instruction. Yet illness, absence, age, urgency, and individual ability could change what any person did on a particular day. Winter has never shown much respect for a tidy chart of responsibilities. Consider the tule mat lying between a sleeping family and the cold floor. It begins far from the lodge, in wet ground where reeds must be recognized, cut at a useful stage, gathered into manageable bundles and carried home. The material then has to be dried and worked. A mat that appears in the finished shelter as a simple brown surface contains hours of movement, wet hands, repeated technique, and knowledge of how tightly the reeds should lie. When it later blocks a draft or separates a body from damp earth, the warmth it provides belongs partly to labour completed months earlier. The same is true of a fur robe. Hunting supplied the hide, but a useful covering required more than bringing an animal back. The skin had to be prepared, cleaned, worked, and maintained. Poorly treated material could stiffen or decay. A robe soaked by weather lost much of its comfort until it dried again. By the time it rested over a child near the hearth, several kinds of labour had met inside one object. The hunter is visible in many later descriptions. The hands that turned the hide into dependable winter covering are easier for a hurried record to overlook. That imbalance in the sources matters. Outsiders tended to notice activities that looked dramatic, public, or familiar to them: hunting, warfare, negotiation, and male leadership. Domestic work was often compressed into a few words, even when it consumed much of the day and made survival possible. A military report might describe a lava stronghold in detail because officers needed to understand its defences. It was less likely to record who kept bedding dry, portioned food, soothed children, or searched for fuel while living under pressure. The archive can make protection look like stone walls and armed positions because paperwork enjoys anything it can draw on a map. Inside the shelter, however, authority could be very practical. The person who knew how smoke moved might decide where the fire belonged. Someone familiar with the needs of an older relative might choose the safest sleeping place. A skilled food preparer controlled whether stored seeds, fish, or meat were wasted. A person who remembered a dangerous crevice could keep children away from it without holding any formal title. Household power often appeared as trusted judgment. The right to say that this mat must be moved, this fuel saved, or this cave abandoned before nightfall. Those decisions carried unequal costs. The warmest position was usually limited. Space closest to a controlled fire could be given to a young child, someone ill, or an older person, while a healthier adult accepted the colder edge. A caregiver might wake repeatedly to check coals, adjust covering, or listen for changes in breathing. Someone else had to leave the shelter at first light to fetch water or wood. The family survived as a group, but the lost sleep, cold hands, and repeated trips were absorbed by particular bodies. Village life could spread some of that burden beyond a single household. Related families living near one another could share knowledge, labour, food, and warnings, though the exact pattern varied and should not be idealised. Cooperation did not remove scarcity. A household with weaker food stores still faced harder choices. A family struck by illness required help from people whose own work did not pause. Generosity strengthened social ties. But every shared basket or armful of wood came from somewhere. Community warmth was real precisely because it cost effort. This gives the volcanic landscape a different meaning. A cave close to fuel, water, and familiar paths might be useful even if it offered only modest thermal protection. A more sheltered chamber several difficult miles away could become a poor choice for a family carrying children, food, and bedding. Distance converts quickly into cold. The safest-looking rock formation on a map may demand so much energy to reach and supply that its protection is spent before anyone lies down. Seasonal settlements near lakes and rivers reduced some of that expense. Water. Wetland foods, tule, fish, and known travel routes were connected. An earth lodge built within that working landscape allowed people to combine shelter with access. A volcanic cave belonged to the same homeland, but it did not automatically sit inside the best network of daily needs. The question was never simply, which place feels warmest? It was, which place can this household continue to live from tomorrow morning? A shelter that required a dangerous climb for water failed differently from one that leaked. A chamber too narrow for stored food created another kind of cold, because hunger would arrive later. A hidden refuge useful during conflict might isolate people from fishing grounds or gathering places. A deep cave could protect against wind, while increasing the labor needed for light and fuel. Each advantage moved a cost onto someone, and that someone was often the person already carrying the heaviest bundle. By evening, those bundles returned to the lodge or temporary shelter. A mat was unrolled, food was measured, a robe was examined for dampness. Older voices corrected younger hands without needing to announce that a lesson was taking place. Around the fire, skill became routine, and routine became security. What looked from outside like a family resting through frost was actually a web of work arranged so carefully that much of it became invisible. That invisibility is the hidden rule beneath every warm shelter in this story. Stone could interrupt the wind. Earth could slow the loss of heat. Fire could brighten a small circle. But the comfort of one sleeping person often rested on another person remaining awake, remembering the route, tending the coals, or deciding that the cave ahead was impressive, cold, and not worth the climb. The climb mattered because every step spent warmth before the shelter could save any. A person carrying a child, food, bedding, or fuel did not arrive at a cave as a clean figure in a survival diagram. The body arrived tired. Hands were already cold. Breath had grown faster. A useful shelter had to repay the energy required to reach it, and many impressive places failed that test before anyone crossed the entrance. That hidden arithmetic shaped the value of the entire landscape. A low ridge that stopped the wind might be more useful than a deep tube farther away. A partly buried lodge near water and stored food could outperform a dramatic cave that demanded a long walk across broken basalt. The best shelter was rarely the place with the most stone overhead. It was the place that reduced cold without separating the household from everything needed to remain alive. Water came first in that calculation. Even during frost, people needed it for drinking, cooking, and preparing food. A refuge far from a dependable source required repeated journeys, and each journey opened the body to wind and dampness. Carrying water over jagged lava also created the risk of a fall. One injured ankle could turn a manageable winter routine into a family emergency. The landscape did not charge rent, but it collected payment in distance. Fuel followed close behind. A cave could block the wind and still become useless if wood had to be carried too far. Firewood was bulky, and its value disappeared quickly in a smoky chamber or a badly chosen draft. A family might spend hours gathering enough fuel for a night, only to discover that the cave pulled warm air toward a second opening. The lesson would be remembered, because it had cost something. The next choice would begin with the wind rather than the darkness. Food created a third limit. Stored fish, meat, seeds, roots, or other prepared foods had weight and needed protection. Moving into a temporary shelter meant deciding how much could be carried, what could be left behind, and how long the refuge might be needed. A short stay required one kind of preparation. Several days required another. Uncertainty made every basket important. Bring too little, and hunger arrives. Bring too much, and the journey itself exhausts the people carrying it. This is why seasonal movement should not be confused with constant improvisation. Modoc families moved through known places at known times for fishing, hunting, gathering, and other work. Repeated travel could make routes, water sources, shelter points, and food areas familiar. Knowledge reduced risk because people were not entering an empty wilderness. They were moving through a homeland filled with remembered relationships between places. A lake was connected to fish, tule, waterfowl, and travel. A marsh edge was connected to reeds, seeds, mud, and seasonal change. Higher ground was connected to hunting and weather exposure. Volcanic formations offered walls, openings, broken surfaces, and refuge, but also cold pockets, sharp stone, and difficult movement. The land did not present separate categories called food, shelter, and danger. Each place could contain all three. That overlap helps explain why a winter village was so valuable. The lodge stood within a network already prepared for daily life. Paths were familiar. Nearby households could exchange warnings or help. Food stores, tools, mats, and fuel were arranged with repeated use in mind. Even if the shelter was modest, the system around it made it strong. A cave entered during sudden frost had to borrow strength from what people could carry into it. The difference becomes visible in the floor. A lodge floor could be maintained, covered, cleared, and arranged over time. Sleeping places became known. The hearth belonged in a familiar position. Children learned where to step. A cave floor might be uneven, dusty, damp, or cut by cracks. Before rest began, someone had to turn strange ground into temporary domestic space. Loose stones were moved. Mats were placed where bodies would lose the least heat. Fuel was kept close enough to use, but far enough from sparks. The shelter became safer through small decisions that left almost no trace for later historians. Those decisions also reveal why family knowledge mattered more than individual toughness. A strong adult could endure cold for a while, but endurance alone did not choose the driest ledge or preserve enough fuel for dawn. A child might notice a draft at floor level before an adult standing upright felt it. An older person might remember which opening held ice after clear winter nights. Someone experienced with fire could read the movement of smoke. Useful information came from different bodies. Leadership inside such a shelter could therefore shift with the problem. The person deciding where to sleep might not be the person who led a hunt or spoke in a formal gathering. Practical authority belonged to whoever understood the immediate pressure. That could mean knowledge of food, children, weather, fire, or the route back to water. Survival made room for quiet expertise, even when the surviving written record did not bother to name it. The record is especially thin around ordinary domestic choices. Archaeology may identify occupation, hearth remains, tools, food traces, or worked materials. Ethnographic accounts may describe dwelling forms and seasonal practices. Military documents may record caves when they become defensive positions. But none of these sources gives us a complete evening inside every shelter. The exact arrangement of bodies, robes, baskets, and fuel must remain uncertain unless evidence supports it. That uncertainty does not leave the cave empty. It changes the kind of story we can tell. Instead of pretending to watch one specific Modoc family perform a perfectly documented routine, we can follow the pressures that any real occupation had to answer. Cold air moved according to the shape of the chamber. Smoke needed an exit. Bodies needed dry insulation. Food and water had to remain accessible. Children, elders, and injured people changed what counted as a safe route. The physical problems are visible even when the private conversation is gone. One pressure could also overturn another. Closing an entrance with mats or other material might reduce a draft, but it could worsen smoke. Moving deeper might hide the household from wind, but increase darkness and place people in colder, pooled air. Building a larger fire might warm the nearest bodies, while consuming fuel needed for mourning. Every solution had a second edge. The safest choice was often a balance rather than a victory. That balance is the quiet incentive beneath the title. The goal was not maximum heat. Maximum heat could waste fuel, fill the shelter with smoke, and force everyone to open the space again. The goal was sufficient warmth at an acceptable cost. Keep the body dry, stop the strongest wind, preserve food, protect the people most vulnerable to cold, save enough fuel to reach daylight. A household that understood those limits did not defeat winter. It prevented winter from taking more than it was given. By night, the chosen shelter might still feel cold. The stone remained stone. Frost waited outside. Yet the bedding stayed dry. The fire remained small. And the path to water was known. A robe was moved toward the person who needed it most. Someone listened to the draft and decided the entrance covering could remain where it was. In that moment, geothermal heat mattered less than a more human kind of warmth. The warmth created when a family knew exactly which comforts it could afford to keep. Affording that comfort became harder when the weather changed faster than the household could prepare. Frost by itself was familiar. A sudden sequence of freezing nights, wet wind, illness, or damaged shelter created a different problem. The system still worked, but every part of it had less room for error. A mat that stayed damp for one evening might be manageable. Damp bedding through several nights pulled warmth from the body again and again. A shortage of fuel for one morning was inconvenient. A shortage lasting a week changed who could rest and who had to keep walking. Cold rarely arrived alone. Wind loosened coverings and found gaps around the roof. Rain or melting snow could enter places that had seemed dry. Smoke behaved differently when air pressure shifted. Paths became slippery. Fish and waterfowl did not appear according to household need, and stored food did not increase because the night was longer than expected. The family's careful balance could be disturbed by several small failures that were individually ordinary and collectively dangerous. A lodge roof offered the first line of defense, but earth and tule required maintenance. Covering material could settle, erode, or become saturated. Poles could weaken. A draft that had been tolerable in autumn might become sharp during a clear winter night. Repair meant going outside with materials, tools, and cold hams. It also meant deciding whether the problem was serious enough to spend scarce energy immediately. History often presents shelter as a completed object. The people living inside experienced it as a structure that kept asking questions. Which gap should be closed first? Could a mat be moved without exposing another wall? Was there enough dry material to repair the roof and still protect the sleeping floor? Should fuel be burned now to dry damp bedding, or saved for the colder hours before dawn? Each choice protected one part of the household by placing pressure somewhere else. There was no perfect answer waiting beneath the ash. The people most vulnerable to cold made those choices urgent. Infants and small children lose heat quickly. Older people may have less physical reserve. Illness can reduce appetite, movement, and the body's ability to remain warm. A person with wet clothing or an injury cannot simply work harder until the problem disappears. When one member of the household needed extra warmth, everyone else's portion of fuel, food, space, or sleep could change. That redistribution was easy to miss from outside. A visitor might see several people beneath robes around one fire, and describe a warm communal interior. The same scene could contain a caregiver who had slept little, an adult who had surrendered the driest mat, and someone preparing to leave before daylight for wood. Shared warmth did not mean shared cost. The circle around the hearth was equal only in shape. A prolonged cold spell could push a household toward help from relatives or neighbouring lodges. Food might be shared. A repair might require several people. Someone with better knowledge of a nearby shelter could offer advice or space. Cooperation increased resilience, but it also created obligations. Receiving support today could mean returning labour, food, or assistance later. Social ties were part of winter technology because no family could manufacture every kind of security alone. The same principle applied to information. A warning that one cave held ice, that a route had become unsafe, or that a spring was difficult to reach could save hours of wasted effort. Knowledge moved through relationships. It was more useful when trusted, and trust grew through repeated experience. An outsider might see only black rock and several openings. People who had lived within the landscape could distinguish a refuge from a trap before the difference became painful. Still, knowledge did not make anyone invulnerable. Weather can exceed experience. An opening remembered as dry might flood after unusual conditions. A familiar path could become blocked. A fire could fail. Stored food could spoil. The practical intelligence of Modoc families lay partly in recognizing limits, not pretending that skill erased them. Survival knowledge is often most visible in the decision to leave a place that almost works. Leaving, however, had its own cost. Bedding had to be gathered, food and tools had to be packed, children and older relatives had to cross the same cold ground as everyone else. A small ember might be carried carefully, or a new fire started later, depending on the circumstances and available materials. Every object included in the load made the journey harder. Every object left behind might be missed before morning. A cave shelter could become attractive at precisely this point, when a lodge was damaged, travel was interrupted, or immediate protection mattered more than long-term comfort. The rock roof did not need repair. Wind could be reduced quickly. People could stop moving and begin arranging what they had brought. Yet the cave also removed many advantages of the prepared home. Stored supplies were elsewhere. The hearth was unfamiliar. The floor had no established sleeping places. A refuge saved time at the entrance and demanded it again inside. The first fire revealed the bargain. Smoke might rise cleanly toward an opening, or it might collect under a shelf of basalt. The flame could show a draft that cold skin had missed. Shadows exposed cracks and uneven ground. A dry-looking wall might release moisture as the air warmed. The cave did not announce whether it would cooperate. It answered slowly, through smoke, dampness, and the behavior of the people trying to rest. Someone then had to decide whether to remain. That decision could not be based on warmth alone. Was the air tolerable? Could water be reached? Was the route safe after dark? Would the available fuel last? Did the cave protect the household from the weather without placing children near dangerous drops? A colder but familiar lodge might still be safer than a slightly warmer chamber that isolated the family from food and help. This is where the title's simple image begins to turn. The volcanic cave was not an automatic solution used whenever frost appeared. Its value increased when the ordinary system was under pressure, and even then it had to pass a series of tests. The more desperate the situation, the more tempting it became to ignore those tests. That temptation was itself a danger. A tired family reaches shelter differently from a rested one. Fatigue makes a short route feel longer, and a bad floor seem acceptable. Hunger encourages a larger fire and quicker use of food. Cold hands rush tasks that normally require care. Children become quieter, which can feel like relief even when it signals that they are losing energy. The physical strain of reaching refuge can reduce the judgment needed to use it safely. Experienced adults could slow that process by turning urgency into sequence. First, stop the strongest exposure. Then find dry ground. Protect the most vulnerable. Test the smoke. Preserve fuel. Keep food and water accessible. None of those steps required a cave to be geothermally warm. They required people to manage danger in the correct order. Outside, frost might thicken over the basalt while wind moved across the basin. Inside, a small fire marked only part of the shelter. Beyond its light, the cave remained cold and unknown. The family's safety depended on resisting the comforting idea that reaching stone walls meant the struggle was over. The real test began after arrival, when every limited resource had to be placed where it could prevent the next small failure from becoming the first irreversible one. The first irreversible failure was rarely dramatic at the moment it began. It might be a child growing too quiet, a water container slipping on frozen stone, or smoke refusing to leave the chamber. The danger came from sequence. One problem consumed the strength needed to solve the next, until the household was no longer choosing between good options, only deciding which loss could be delayed. That sequence becomes easier to understand when we look at the best documented moment when Modoc families occupied the lava country through severe winter conditions. During the Modoc War of 1872 and 1873, about 150 men, women and children lived for months within the broken terrain later called Captain Jack's Stronghold. The place was a natural fortress of trenches, ridges, cracks and small caves near the southern edge of Tule Lake. It was defensible because the people inside knew its paths and because those approaching it did not. But defensible did not mean comfortable. The winter refuge contained families, not only warriors. Food, water, bedding, children, older relatives, smoke, illness and cold all entered the stronghold with them. The same rock walls that confused soldiers did not prepare meals or warm a sleeping child. Military history tends to notice firing positions and lines of approach. Family history notices whether a person can cross those same rocks in darkness while carrying water. This is where the meaning of the cave changes. Earlier, the volcanic shelter seemed valuable because it interrupted wind and slowed exposure. Under military pressure, concealment and defense could become more important than warmth. A narrow passage that made household movement awkward might also make an assault difficult. A deep trench that collected cold air could protect people from gunfire. The terrain's disadvantages did not disappear. They were accepted because the danger outside had become worse. That is a different kind of thermal strategy. The family was no longer selecting the most comfortable winter shelter available within an ordinary seasonal round. It was trying to preserve life after violence had disrupted access to villages. Stored food, familiar lodges, and safe movement. Warmth had to be produced inside a place, chosen partly for reasons that had nothing to do with warmth. The cave did not solve the crisis. It held the crisis in a smaller space. The records tell us that the stronghold sheltered Modoc families through harsh winter months, but they do not preserve a complete domestic schedule. We should resist turning gaps into cinematic certainty. We cannot assign every person a sleeping place or describe every meal. We can, however, follow the pressures fixed by the setting. Water still had to reach the people inside. Fuel still had to be gathered or carried. Food stores had to be protected. Smoke had to be tolerated or directed. Families had to move through jagged ground that outsiders found exhausting even in daylight. The ground itself became part of the defense. In January 1873, soldiers and volunteers attempted to attack through dense fog and bitter cold. They struggled over rough lava without intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Modoc defenders used the natural trenches and concealed positions more effectively. The episode later encouraged an image of the lava beds as an almost magical fortress. Yet the magic was familiarity. Basalt did not choose sides. Knowledge made one group mobile and left another stumbling. For the families living there, that same familiarity could reduce daily risk. A route between sheltered spaces might be nearly invisible to someone standing only a short distance away. A depression could block wind. A low ridge could conceal movement. A small cave could protect supplies or people for a time. The Stronghold was not one grand chamber warmed from below. It was a network of uneven places whose value came from how they connected. Connection is the midpoint of this story. The original question asked how Modoc families used geothermal heat within volcanic cave shelters during frost. The better question is how families turned many weak advantages into one functioning system. Stable ground temperature mattered in some spaces. Wind protection mattered in others. Fire, robes, mats, food, water, roots, and social cooperation completed the arrangement. Remove those connections, and the cave returned to being cold stone. This also explains why the title cannot be reduced to a clever survival trick. There was no single secret, such as sleeping at a certain depth or placing a fire against one wall. Different caves behaved differently. Different households had different needs. Weather changed the airflow. Crisis changed the purpose of the shelter. The real skill was adjustment, recognizing which advantage mattered most at a particular moment, and refusing to demand that one place provide everything. At the Stronghold, a sheltered position could conserve life while increasing labor. Water and food had to pass through defended terrain. Fires risked revealing locations or creating smoke. Crowding made privacy and clean air harder to maintain. Children could not be treated as silent pieces of military equipment, however convenient that would have been for the paperwork. Family needs continued inside a landscape being described by outsiders mainly as a battlefield. That difference in description shapes what survives. Army accounts measured troops, weapons, deaths, and assaults. Later histories often followed the same path because conflict leaves abundant documents. Domestic survival appears indirectly, in the simple fact that women and children remained in the Stronghold for months. Their presence forces a second set of questions. Who found fuel? Who prepared food? Who comforted frightened children? Who cared for illness? And who kept people from wandering into dangerous cracks? The records rarely answer in satisfying detail. Their silence shows where official attention was pacing. The missing detail should make us more careful, not less interested. We can acknowledge the courage and practical knowledge required without inventing heroic scenes. We can also avoid romanticizing the refuge. Remaining in volcanic caves and trenches during winter was not evidence that hardship was easy for Modoc families. It was evidence that displacement and attack had narrowed the available choices until an austere natural fortress became the safest home left. The word home is difficult there. A home usually contains continuity, known sleeping places, ordinary work, neighboring relationships, stored materials, and the expectation of tomorrow. The Stronghold contained pieces of those things, carried in by families and rebuilt under pressure. But it was also temporary, crowded, threatened, and shaped by conflict. Calling it a shelter is accurate. Calling it comfortable would be a kindness the evidence has not earned. By the middle of the winter, the distinction between natural and human warmth would have been impossible to miss. Stone interrupted bullets and wind, trenches hid movement, small caves gave cover. Yet every usable pocket depended on people bringing food, fire, bedding, care, memory, and discipline into it. The heat did not rise generously from the ancient lava. It moved from bodies, coals, and work, then remained only as long as the surrounding system held. Outside, the basalt looked empty beneath frost and fog. Inside, its broken lines and entire community occupied spaces that an approaching army could barely read. The true advantage was not that the volcanic ground was warm, it was that Modoc knowledge had made the ground legible, and in a winter of forced choices, knowing how to read cold stone could keep a family alive long enough to face the danger waiting beyond it. The danger waiting beyond the lava did not remain outside. It entered the stronghold as a problem of decisions. A sheltered trench could protect one group while leaving another farther from water. A small cave might hide children and supplies, but offer poor air once a fire was lit. A route useful to defenders could be too rough for an injured person or an older relative. The landscape gave options, yet every option asked who would carry its cost. Before the war, Modoc communities were organised in relatively small, autonomous bands. National Park Service accounts describe a laki or head as a domestic advisor expected to use judgment, diplomacy, and moral character rather than rule through unchecked command. Important village decisions could be made through an assembly in which adult men and women had the right to speak. Crisis did not necessarily erase those habits, though the surviving record is too uneven to reconstruct each discussion inside the stronghold. It does remind us that a community under pressure was not simply waiting for one famous man to decide everything. Later storytelling often narrows the Modoc War until Captain Jack stands almost alone in the lava beds. Kintpuash was central, but the sheltering community included families, advisors, other leaders, and people whose names rarely entered military reports. Their needs could conflict with purely defensive logic. A warrior might value a narrow position with a clear view of an approach. A caregiver might value level ground, cleaner air, and a short route to water. The strongest military shelter and the safest family shelter were not always the same place. That difference would have pressed on every limited resource. Put the driest bedding where children could use it, and adults accepted a colder floor. Keep a fire small to reduce smoke or avoid drawing attention, and less heat reached the outer edge of the group. Store food deep within protected rock, and someone had to carry it across uneven ground whenever it was needed. Move supplies closer to daily life, and they became more exposed. Defense is often described as holding a position. Family survival meant moving through it repeatedly without wasting strength. The burden of repetition mattered. One trip for water seems simple when written in a sentence. The 20th trip crosses the same sharp stone with more fatigue and less concentration. One night of interrupted sleep can be endured. Weeks of listening for danger, tending children, watching fuel, and adjusting bedding change the body. Cold does not need a spectacular moment if it can collect small payments every hour. Crowding made those payments harder to hide. Warm bodies could raise the temperature of a protected pocket, but more people also produced more moisture and used more air. Breath condensed on colder surfaces. Wet materials dried slowly. Smoke found eyes already irritated by fatigue. Private discomfort became public because there was little space in which to withdraw from it. The volcanic shelter conserved some heat by gathering people close, then charged them in noise, dampness, and lost privacy. Even geology can discover communal living rules. Children changed the rhythm of the refuge most sharply. Modoc family life placed strong value on child rearing, participation, and praise. In ordinary conditions, children learned through useful activity. In a defended winter shelter, their work had to remain within the limits of safety. A child might carry something light, remain near a trusted adult, or learn which passage not to enter. But the rough ground and the threat beyond it reduced freedom. The very landscape that adults could read as protection might appear to a child as a maze of forbidden edges. Older people carried a different contradiction. Their knowledge could identify routes, shelter qualities, seasonal signs, and social obligations that younger adults needed. At the same time, cold, illness, or reduced mobility might make the stronghold especially demanding for them. A community could depend on a person's memory, while also needing to protect that person from the physical cost of using it. Knowledge was not stored in the cave walls, it lived in bodies. And bodies could be exhausted. The loss of elders through earlier epidemics had already damaged the transmission of cultural knowledge. National Park Service interpretation notes that repeated smallpox outbreaks struck the Modoc homeland before the war, and that older people, among the most vulnerable, included leaders and keepers of knowledge. By the winter of 1872 and 1873, the community entering the lava beds carried not an untouched ancient system, but one already injured by disease, violence, displacement, and inadequate government provisions. Their success in the stronghold grew from resilience under accumulated pressure, not from an ideal world preserved underground. That wider history changes how we hear the word adaptation. It can sound cheerful, as though people simply became cleverer whenever conditions worsened. Real adaptation often means performing old skills after access to the places supporting them has been damaged. It means using a refuge because a village is unsafe, rationing food because ordinary gathering has been interrupted, and turning defensive cracks into domestic space because better choices have been closed. Ingenuity deserves respect, but hardship should not receive credit for inspiring it. The stronghold's natural protection also created a false impression for outsiders. Soldiers struggling through fog and broken lava could imagine the Modoc had disappeared into a perfect fortress. From a distance, the network of ridges and trenches seemed to erase the people inside. Yet invisibility worked both ways. It concealed Modoc defenders from attack, while also hiding family labour from the written history produced around the campaign. The army saw positions. Newspapers saw a dramatic siege. The daily work of making those positions livable slipped between the categories. Smoke-stained caves can preserve evidence that fires burned there, but soot does not identify the hand that fed the flame. A discarded object may show presence without explaining the argument that placed it there. Military maps can trace approaches while ignoring the shortest route between a sleeping place and a water container. The surviving evidence is strongest where conflict made people visible to officials, and weakest where family care remained ordinary. The silence is not proof of one exact routine. It is a warning about whose activity was considered worth describing. Within the community, authority may have moved according to need. A recognized leader could advise on peace or defense, while another person understood food stores, children, or the behavior of smoke in a particular shelter. Decisions affecting everyone carried the weight of consensus and relationship, even when urgency shortened discussion. No household could afford a permanent argument while frost, hunger, and military danger were all keeping their own schedules. Cooperation was not a decorative virtue. It was a way of reducing the heat lost through conflict inside the group. This is the deeper contradiction of the volcanic refuge. The terrain protected Modoc autonomy because outsiders could not easily read it. But families survived inside that terrain only by making themselves highly readable to one another. Someone had to notice who was cold, roof was missing, who had eaten, which supply was low, and which route had become unsafe. Concealment from the army depended on attention within the community. By night, a low fire might reveal only the nearest faces. Beyond them, basalt divided the darkness into passages, ledges, and sheltered pockets. The strength of the place did not lie in one warm chamber. It lay in a web of people who knew that a defense could fail without being breached. It could fail through hunger, smoke, exhaustion, disagreement, or one vulnerable person overlooked in the dark. Reading the stone was essential. Reading one another was what kept the stone from becoming a prison. A prison begins when every useful exit becomes too costly to use. The Stronghold resisted that condition through its network of cracks, trenches, ledges, and narrow passages. No single opening carried all movement. If one route became exposed, another might still remain hidden. If one sheltered pocket filled with smoke, people could shift to another. Those openings mattered because air, water, food, and people all needed movement. A sealed chamber might hold warmth for a short time, but it also held smoke, moisture, and stale air. A wide entrance improved ventilation while inviting wind. Two openings could create a useful draft or turn the shelter into a tunnel for cold. The best arrangement depended on weather, fire size, crowding, and the shape of the cave. There was no permanent answer. A shelter that worked on a still night might behave badly when the wind changed direction. The same uncertainty applied to heat. Warm air rose, but a cave ceiling could trap it above the people who needed it. Cold air sank and might gather in lower passages. A small fire warmed the nearest space, while rough stone beyond the light remained cold enough to draw heat from anyone lying against it. Moving upward within the shelter could improve warmth but reduce headroom or make footing less secure. Moving closer to the entrance improved air and daylight while exposing sleepers to frost. Finding that band required observation over time. Smoke showed where air travelled. Damp patches showed where moisture collected. Frost lingering near an entrance revealed how deeply cold had entered. Ash and embers showed whether a hearth could remain controlled. These signs were practical, but they were not a written formula. People had to notice them while tired and under threat. Routes through the Stronghold also connected domestic spaces to defensive ones. A passage useful for moving between concealed positions might cross near places where families rested or stored supplies. The surviving military descriptions emphasized tactical movement because that was what officers needed to understand. They tell us less about how children, caregivers, and older people used the same ground. Yet every defensive route passing through a lived space created rules. Where people could sleep, when a fire could burn, which objects had to remain movable, and who needed warning before armed men crossed in darkness. The family shelter could therefore never become completely settled. Bedding arranged carefully in the evening might need to be lifted if a route had to remain open. Food placed in a protected hollow had to be accessible without blocking movement. A child could not wander into a trench simply because adults recognized it as part of the landscape. The refuge demanded domestic order while refusing the stability that usually makes domestic order easy. That refusal became sharper when supplies ran low. A good hidden route was valuable only if it led somewhere useful. Water still had to be reached. Fuel still had to enter. Food could be stored, but stores diminished. Each trip outside the protected network exposed people to observation, cold, and fatigue. The Stronghold's many exits prevented enclosure, yet every exit also created another point of risk. The loophole in the stone was not free. Someone had to use it. The person chosen for that task absorbed more than the distance. Leaving a relatively sheltered pocket meant adjusting clothing, crossing uneven basalt, and carrying weight back through narrow paths. A water container made balance harder. Food gathered or retrieved beyond the refuge had to arrive without being lost or spoiled. When a person returned, cold entered with them through the opening, along with whatever news the landscape had offered. News itself became a resource. A route might be watched. A familiar spring might be harder to reach. Soldiers could be moving closer. Weather might be changing beyond the shelter's limited view. People who travelled outside brought back information that affected where others slept and how much fuel could be used. The volcanic terrain concealed the community, but concealment also reduced visibility. Someone had to step beyond protection so everyone else could understand what protection still meant. This is another reason the caves cannot be imagined as independent winter homes. Their usefulness depended on connections extending outward. Paths, water, food, fuel, neighbouring knowledge, and the possibility of leaving. A shelter becomes dangerous when it solves the problem of the present hour by cutting off the next day. The strongest stone walls are poor company if they place the household beyond the reach of every necessary resource. In ordinary seasonal life, Modoc villages beside lakes and rivers were supported by networks built over years. People knew where to fish, where tule grew, which routes connected camps, and where relatives could be found. The Stronghold drew on that same landscape knowledge, but under conditions distorted by war. Familiar places were no longer freely accessible. Movement carried military danger. A route once used for daily work could become a line between survival and capture. The refuge's great advantage was flexibility. Broken lava allowed small groups to move without presenting one clear target. But flexibility required discipline. An opening could not be blocked carelessly. A fire could not be placed only for immediate comfort. Supplies had to remain portable enough to move if pressure shifted. That comparison has limits because people are not stone. They became hungry, frightened, ill, tired, and divided. Decisions about peace, resistance, movement, and surrender did not produce one permanent agreement. The Modoc War included disagreements within the band, pressure from outside, and choices made under increasingly narrow conditions. We should not flatten those tensions into a story of perfect unity. Cooperation could be essential and still be difficult. The same was true inside a family. One person might want more fire, while another needed cleaner air. Someone might judge a route safe, while an older relative could not manage it. A child might need rest at the exact moment supplies needed moving. A poorly timed decision could waste fuel, expose movement, or leave a vulnerable person separated from help. By April 1873, the Stronghold's defensive advantage was no longer absolute. After renewed fighting, the Modoc occupants left the position rather than remain fixed inside it. The army had not made the basalt disappear. What changed was the balance around it: pressure, supply, movement, and the danger attached to staying. The strongest proof that the refuge was never a magical fortress is that survival eventually required abandoning it. Leaving did not mean the landscape had failed. It meant the landscape had reached the limit of what it could provide under those conditions. A shelter can block wind, conceal movement, and slow an enemy, but it cannot restore lost access to food, end political conflict, or make every route safe forever. The decision to leave may have preserved mobility when remaining would have turned protection into confinement. Behind the departing group, the trenches and caves stayed where they had always been. Cold air still settled into low places, smoke marks remained on stone. The openings that once carried water, fuel, warnings, and people became quiet again. Their final lesson was not that every cave hides a secret source of heat. It was that shelter remains useful only while there is a way through it, a way beyond it, and enough human judgment to know when the last warm place has become the wrong place to stay. Staying had become wrong. But leaving did not restore the world that had made shelter possible. Once the Modoc families moved out of the stronghold, they carried what they could across a landscape that was familiar in shape and increasingly closed in use. A known spring might lie beyond soldiers. A remembered village might no longer be safe. Food grounds, stored materials, and prepared lodges could exist only a few miles away and still be unreachable. Distance was no longer measured by walking alone. It was measured by danger. That change reveals the true limit of every survival technique in this story. Knowledge works through access. A person may know exactly where tule grows, which shore offers fish, which cave mouth blocks the north wind, and which earth lodge needs repair before frost. But knowledge cannot gather reeds from guarded wetlands or retrieve food from an abandoned village. When families were separated from the places supporting their skills, the problem was not that they had forgotten how to live. The structure connecting knowledge to land had been broken. The breaking had begun before the war. In 1864, a treaty placed the Modoc, Klamath and Yahuskin peoples on one reservation in the Klamath Basin. The agreement did not erase older boundaries, rivalries, or different relationships with particular places. Modoc families who moved onto the reservation encountered tension, insecurity, and provisions that were often inadequate. Some eventually returned toward the Lost River country, where familiar waters, gathering places, and family connections offered a stronger basis for life than promises issued from an agency. Returning home did not return control. Settlers occupied parts of the region. Officials demanded removal. The conflict that followed narrowed ordinary movement until the stronghold became a refuge. In that sense, the winter caves were the last link in a long pressure chain. First, access to normal villages and subsistence areas became contested. Then families concentrated in broken lava because it could be defended. At last, military pressure forced them away from even that limited shelter. Cold stone was not the original problem. Dispossession was. This matters because popular survival stories often isolate technology from politics. They ask how a family stayed warm, as though the answer must be a fire method, a wall thickness, or a secret cave. Those details matter, but they operate inside a social world. A lodge remains warm because people are allowed to return to it. Food remains available because gathering grounds can be reached. Fuel can be collected because movement is not treated as trespass or rebellion. Once those conditions disappear, the best designed shelter begins to fail from the outside inward. The people most affected were not always those making the most visible military decisions. Children depended on adults who were now moving, negotiating, defending, gathering, and caring at the same time. Older people carried knowledge but faced difficult travel. Anyone ill or injured required food, warmth, and attention, while the group possessed less of each. Women's domestic labour continued, yet the materials and stable spaces that normally made that labour effective were being stripped away. The same task took more energy in every new refuge. Imagine the difference between drying a mat inside a familiar lodge and trying to keep bedding usable while moving through temporary camps. At home, the hearth position was known, repair materials were nearby, and sleeping places could remain arranged. In flight, each stop forced the household to rebuild order from the beginning, find dry ground, protect food, test the wind, place the most vulnerable, control the fire, prepare to move again. Repetition did not produce comfort because the place might be abandoned before the work began to pay back its cost. There is no need to invent private despair to understand the burden. The visible facts are enough. Families had spent months in the stronghold through winter, survived attacks, and then left under renewed pressure. The group later divided. Some people sought negotiation or surrender, while others continued to resist. Those choices were made amid hunger, exhaustion, death, and shrinking options. A history that describes only strategy misses how cold and fatigue alter the range of choices long before a formal surrender occurs. Warmth itself became harder to share when the community fragmented. A larger group demanded more supplies, but it could pool labor and knowledge. Smaller groups moved more quietly and might find shelter more easily, yet they had fewer adults to gather food, carry water, maintain fires, and protect children. Separation also divided information. The person who knew one route or spring might no longer be present. A remembered warning could not help people who had taken another path. The lava landscape still offered pockets of protection, but its value changed as people lost the ability to connect those pockets into a stable system. A cave without food access was a pause. A trench without water was a delay. A hidden ledge could protect sleepers for one night and place them farther from help the following morning. The terrain continued doing what it had always done, blocking wind, obscuring sight, slowing movement, and holding cold in low places. Human circumstances determined whether those qualities became shelter or confinement. By early June 1873, the resistance had collapsed, and Kintpuash was captured. The later punishment focused public attention on trials and executions, but the surviving community paid a broader cost. Many Modoc prisoners were removed far from their homeland to Indian territory. The displacement placed people in an unfamiliar environment, separated from the lakes, marshes, lava formations, seasonal routes, and material knowledge that had supported generations of life. The loss was not merely geographic. It was architectural, nutritional, social, and thermal. A tule mat can be carried only so far before it wears out. A fur robe can travel, but the systems for replacing it depend on animals, tools, skill, and land. Knowledge of a particular cave's airflow has little immediate use thousands of miles away. Even memories that remain exact cannot make unfamiliar soil behave like the floor of a Modoc earth lodge. Removal turned detailed local expertise into longing for places where that expertise could once act. Some Modoc people remained in Oregon, and communities endured in more than one place. Their later histories cannot be reduced to loss alone. Cultural knowledge, family ties, and identity continued despite war and removal. Still, endurance should not soften what had been taken. Survival after displacement required another round of adaptation under conditions chosen by others. Praising resilience too eagerly can become a polite way of ignoring the force that made resilience necessary. The title began with geothermal heat, a phrase suggesting that the earth itself offered comfort from below. By this point, the deeper truth runs in the opposite direction. The earth offered forms, materials, and possibilities, but warmth existed only through a relationship between people and place. Break that relationship, and the cave grew colder without changing temperature. The lodge became unavailable without losing a single wall. The wetland ceased to feed a family, not because the plants vanished, but because the family could no longer reach them safely. Behind the people leaving the lava beds, frost would still settle into the cracks. The caves would continue holding their slow, uneven temperatures. Nothing in the geology recorded who had been forced away. Yet the abandoned hearths marked a human change more severe than any cold night. A landscape that remained perfectly capable of sheltering Modoc families had been made inaccessible to the families who knew best how to use it. The stone kept no record of that difference. It held soot, broken objects, worn paths, and the shape of old fires. But it did not explain who had been cold, who had stayed awake, or which family had once known the safest route through the dark. When later visitors entered the lava beds, they could see evidence of use. They could not automatically recover the life that gave each trace its meaning. That silence is where the easiest version of the story begins. A smoke mark becomes proof of a permanent home. A cave becomes a winter village. Volcanic ground becomes geothermal heat. One visible clue is asked to carry an entire household on its back. The result feels satisfying because it turns a complicated system into a single trick. It is also how careful history quietly becomes legend. The surviving sources do not all look in the same direction. Military reports were written to describe conflict, movement, leadership, casualties, supplies, and terrain. Settler accounts often carried fear, hostility, or the assumption that indigenous land use was temporary and therefore less legitimate. Later ethnographic descriptions preserved valuable information about Modoc dwellings, family life, leadership, seasonal foods, and spiritual practice. But they were usually recorded after epidemic disease, displacement, war, and removal had already altered the world being described. Each source can tell us something. None can stand alone without distortion. An officer may describe a cave because it concealed defenders. He is less likely to describe how bedding was arranged or who kept children away from a drop. An ethnographer may record the form of an earth lodge without capturing every seasonal variation between households. Archaeology may reveal hearths, tools, food remains, or repeated occupation, while remaining silent about the voices around the fire. Evidence is not weak because it has limits. It becomes weak when those limits are hidden. The phrase geothermal heat is a useful example. It sounds precise and scientific, yet it can blur several different physical effects. Active geothermal warmth comes from heat within the earth, as at hot springs or heated ground. A lava tube formed by an ancient eruption may instead provide thermal stability, wind protection, or a slower response to outside weather. Some chambers may be relatively mild. Others trap cold air or preserve ice. Calling every protected cave geothermal makes the word warmer than the rock. That does not make the shelter unimportant. A reduction in wind can decide whether a small fire remains useful. A dry ledge can preserve bedding. A stable temperature can protect supplies from rapid freezing and thawing. A basalt wall warmed by sunlight may release a little heat after sunset. These are real advantages, but they depend on orientation, season, cave shape, airflow, and the location of the people inside. The advantage belongs to the relationship between place and practice, not to the volcano acting like a forgotten furnace. Even the word family can flatten more than it reveals. Households differed in size, health, wealth, kin connections, and access to labour. A family with strong food stores and several able adults could manage frost differently from one weakened by illness or loss. Older people might provide essential knowledge while needing more physical support. Women's work with plant materials, hides, food, and domestic shelter could be central and still receive fewer lines in written accounts than hunting or warfare. Children learned through work, but their contributions and risks changed with age. There was no single Modoc winter experience waiting to be reconstructed. Villages stood in different locations, seasons varied. The same shelter could perform differently after rain, snow, wind, or a change in water level. Peace and war altered which routes were safe. Contact with settlers, disease, reservation policy, and military pressure changed access to resources across time. A description that may fit one household in one decade should not be stretched across every Modoc family for centuries. This variation is not an obstacle to the story. It is the story's human scale. A universal rule would make the past simple and distant. Variation brings back judgment. One household repaired an earth lodge before the cold deepened. Another used a lighter mat lodge during a different part of the seasonal round. A temporary rock shelter might help travellers, gatherers, hunters, or people escaping sudden weather. During the war, the same volcanic terrain carried the far heavier burden of defending an entire community under attack. The strongest evidence for prolonged family occupation of the lava formations belongs to that wartime crisis. Even there, the word cave can mislead. Captain Jack's Stronghold was a network of ridges, cracks, trenches, depressions, and small sheltered spaces, not one broad underground room. Its power came from connection and concealment. Turning it into a cozy cave settlement removes the very geography that made it effective. It also removes the hardship. A heroic version of survival shows people defeating winter through cleverness. A responsible version allows cleverness and suffering to exist together. Modoc knowledge helped families endure the stronghold. It did not make smoke pleasant, food unlimited, or danger distant. The ability to survive a harsh refuge should never be mistaken for evidence that the refuge was humane. The same imbalance enters modern language. We say, the Modoc used the terrain, as though land was simply equipment. For Modoc families, the homeland held food, sacred places, roots, villages, stories, relatives, and obligations. A cave opening belonged within that wider world. Its usefulness was not isolated from the lake below, the tule marsh, the remembered path, or the people who knew its name and history. Some of those names and histories were never written down by outsiders. Others may remain within Modoc communities and should not be treated as material automatically available for public storytelling. Respecting the source boundary includes respecting cultural boundaries. Not every silence is an invitation to invent. And not every sacred association should be pulled into a bedtime narrative merely because mystery improves atmosphere. What can be told is already enough. Earth lodges and mat lodges used partial excavation, poles, earth, and tule to moderate winter conditions. Fur robes added insulation. Seasonal movement connected households to fish, waterfowl, game, roots, seeds, and reeds. Volcanic formations offered refuge, concealment, wind protection, and difficult terrain. During the war, families endured months in the stronghold before military pressure forced them out. Afterward, removal severed many people from the local knowledge system that had made the homeland livable. The uncertain parts should remain audible as uncertainty. Some caves were probably used briefly. Some may have sheltered people repeatedly. Fire traces can confirm human presence without telling us whether the visit lasted one evening or many. Oral knowledge may once have distinguished warm, cold, dry, dangerous, or sacred places with far greater precision than surviving public records allow. The missing detail does not need to be filled with confidence. It can remain a dark passage whose depth we admit we cannot see. That admission changes the final image of the cave. It is no longer a primitive room waiting for a modern narrator to explain its secret. It is a place partly visible through geology, archaeology, written records, and living cultural memory, with each form of knowledge illuminating a different wall. The darkness between them is not failure. It is the honest shape of the evidence. Near the entrance, frost may still outline the basalt before sunrise. Farther in, soot may remain where a fire once touched the ceiling. Between those two marks lies almost everything the easy story wants to claim: warmth, family, duration, purpose, and feeling. A careful history does not pretend the stone has answered. It listens to what the stone can hold, then leaves room for the people whose voices were never written into it. The people whose voices were never written into the stone did not disappear simply because later records failed to follow them. Their absence from a military map is not the same as absence from history. Knowledge can survive without becoming a document. It can move through families, place names, warnings, repeated visits, and the quiet correction of a younger person who has misunderstood the ground beneath their feet. That kind of survival is difficult for an archive to measure. A report can count prisoners. A census can list households. A court record can preserve names attached to punishment. None of those forms is designed to notice when someone remembers where cold air collects in a lava tube, how tule should be dried before winter, or which route remains passable after frost. The most practical knowledge may leave no official paper, because it continued doing its work beyond the official's attention. Removal made that continuation harder, not impossible. Modoc people sent to Indian territory had to live far from the lakes, marshes, and volcanic formations that had shaped older routines. Children born there could inherit stories of places they had never seen. Adults carried memories whose daily usefulness had been interrupted. A route through basalt cannot be practiced on a different landscape, but the habit of reading wind, moisture, shelter, and social need does not vanish at a border drawn by government order. Some knowledge changed form. A remembered cave could become part of family history rather than an immediately usable refuge. A story about a winter route could preserve the fact of belonging even when the route itself was inaccessible. Materials changed, climates differed, and new survival skills became necessary. Continuity did not mean repeating the past unchanged. It meant carrying enough of the relationship forward that forced distance did not become complete erasure. For Modoc people who remained in Oregon, the homeland itself also changed. Settler occupation, reservation boundaries, roads, ranching, military memory, and later federal management placed new systems over older ones. The lava beds could be described as a battlefield, a geological wonder, or public land. Each description revealed something true and risked pushing something else out of view. A battlefield emphasizes conflict. A cave map emphasizes shape. A geological label emphasizes eruption. None automatically shows the household labor that once turned pieces of this terrain into temporary safety. The name Captain Jack's Stronghold demonstrates that pressure. It directs attention toward one leader and one war, making the place easier for visitors to recognize. It also narrows a community of men, women, children, advisors, caregivers, and elders into the story of a single famous figure. The name is historically familiar, but familiarity can become a frame so tight that every other life inside it seems secondary. A visitor walking the Stronghold Trail may notice defensive positions because markers and maps make them visible. The same visitor may pass a shallow recess without knowing whether anyone ever slept there, stored something there, or avoided it because the floor held cold. Most such questions cannot be answered with certainty. That uncertainty should not be filled with invented family scenes. It should sharpen attention to the difference between what is easy to mark and what was essential to live. Battle positions can be numbered. Domestic judgment resists numbering. One place may have been useful only when the wind came from a certain direction. Another may have sheltered supplies for a few hours. A low wall could matter to someone crawling under fire and be nearly useless for a child needing sleep. The same piece of basalt held different meanings according to body, weather, purpose, and time. This is why the later public landscape must be read with two sets of eyes. The first sees the extraordinary volcanic terrain, collapsed lava tubes, rough flows, caves, trenches, and ice-bearing chambers. The second asks what human effort was required before any of those features became shelter. The rock can be mapped by length and depth. Human use must also be measured in water carried, fuel spent, smoke endured, bedding protected, and roots remembered. At dawn, those two readings meet near a cave entrance. Pale light reaches the outer rock while the deeper passage remains dark. Frost may cling to the exposed ground, and colder air may still rest below. A person expecting geothermal warmth could step inward and feel the temperature fall. The body corrects the story before the sign does. Volcanic origin has not guaranteed comfort. The cave's value depends on where the air moves, where the floor rises, and what people bring with them. That physical correction is important because modern visitors often arrive with technologies that hide the old pressures. Electric lights remove darkness. Vehicles reduce distance. Water waits nearby. Warm clothing is manufactured elsewhere. A marked trail replaces memory of route. Safety guidance identifies hazards that earlier users had to learn through experience. The landscape remains demanding, but the network surrounding the visitor is completely different. An overnight frost experience beside a parked vehicle cannot recreate a Modoc winter household, nor can a brief walk through a cave reproduce the strain of refuge during war. Modern comparison becomes useful only when it exposes the missing system. The visitor can feel cold stone, observe a draft, or see ice in a chamber. What cannot be casually reproduced is the necessity of making every decision with limited fuel, limited food, vulnerable relatives, and no assurance that the shelter will remain available. The park landscape preserves evidence and also creates distance from that necessity. Railings, maps, named trails, and interpretive signs make dangerous terrain accessible. They allow people to learn without carrying the old risks. Yet they can also make knowledge appear to belong to the institution presenting it, rather than to the people who lived within the homeland long before it became a protected monument. Interpretation is most honest when it names that difference. The caves themselves offer a quiet warning against ownership of the story. No map captures every draft. No label fixes a chamber's temperature for every season. No official name exhausts the meanings attached to a place. Even geology changes slowly, through collapse, moisture, ice, and weathering. The physical landscape refuses to become as simple as the words placed upon it. So the remaining warmth in the story does not sit inside one cave waiting to be discovered. It survives in the act of correction, the insistence that earth lodges mattered, that wetlands supported winter life, that women and children occupied the stronghold, that removal broke access to a working homeland, and that volcanic shelter was conditional rather than magical. Each correction restores one connection that the easier story had cut away. Morning light eventually reaches farther across the entrance, but it does not illuminate the entire passage. The outer frost becomes visible first. Beyond it, the floor drops into shadow, and the air carries information no written label can fully translate. A careful listener pauses there, no longer asking where the hidden furnace was, but wondering who once knew exactly how far into that darkness a family could safely go. How far a family could safely go was never fixed by distance alone. 10 steps into one opening might bring dry ground and still air. 10 steps into another might lead downward into colder air, loose stone, or a ceiling too low for smoke to escape. The boundary between shelter and danger moved with season, weather, age, health, and purpose. What mattered was not how deep the cave appeared, but how accurately the people entering it could read the changing conditions. That kind of reading begins before the cave. The body notices wind direction, moisture, and the loss of sunlight. The feet notice whether the ground slopes upward or drops into a hollow. The nose notices stale air or smoke returning instead of rising. A hand placed against stone may find it dry, wet, or colder than the surrounding air. None of these observations is spectacular. Together they decide whether bedding stays usable, whether a small fire helps, and whether a sleeping child remains warm until morning. Modern language often separates knowledge into categories: geology, weather, architecture, food storage, medicine, childcare. A winter household could not afford those divisions. The person choosing a sleeping place also needed to think about smoke. The person protecting food had to think about animals, dampness, and the route to water. The person caring for an older relative had to judge both temperature and footing. Knowledge became useful only when its parts met inside one decision. This is why the most important technology may have been judgment rather than any single object. Mats, robes, hearths, earth coverings, cave walls, and stored food all mattered. Yet each could fail if used without attention to the others. A thick robe over damp clothing trapped a different problem. A large fire in poor ventilation created danger. A deep cave with stable temperature could still be unsuitable if its floor collected cold air. Technology worked through relationships, and judgment kept those relationships from turning against the household. Judgment also needed continuity between generations. A warning remembered from an older relative could prevent a younger adult from choosing the wrong chamber. A child sent to gather something light might learn, almost without ceremony, which path remained dry after frost. Repetition made knowledge ordinary. That ordinariness is one reason it left so little dramatic evidence. People rarely create a written record each time they avoid a known danger. War, removal, and restricted access disrupted this transfer by separating people from the places where knowledge could be practiced. A remembered instruction about a particular spring or cave has depth because it can be tested, corrected, and demonstrated on the ground. Far away, the same instruction may survive as story, identity, or family memory, but its physical details become harder to renew. The loss is not only of information, it is the loss of the setting that lets information remain precise. Returning to a homeland, when possible, can therefore mean more than visiting a location. It can restore scale. A cave described in a book becomes a real entrance with wind moving across it. A route remembered as short reveals its roughness underfoot. A wetland seen from a distance becomes a network of reeds, water, mud, food, and seasonal change. Place corrects the imagination. It shows which parts of inherited memory fit the ground and which details have been blurred by time or outsider retelling. The same correction applies to public history. A sign may explain that Modoc families sheltered in the Stronghold during the war. The statement is true, but the terrain adds the part the sentence cannot carry. Walking even a short distance over broken lava reveals the labour hidden inside the word sheltered. A protected pocket may lie only yards away and still require careful movement. A person carrying water or supporting someone with weak footing experiences those yards differently from a visitor following a marked trail. This physical difficulty should not be used to turn suffering into spectacle. The point is not to imagine that every step was misery or every cave a nightmare. People brought skill, humour, family life, disagreement, routine, and adaptation into hard places. But respect for their ability requires an honest measure of the conditions they managed. Admiration becomes shallow when it erases the cost. The cost also warns against treating indigenous knowledge as a collection of survival tips available for anyone to borrow. A technique separated from its people and history can become another form of taking. Modoc knowledge developed within relationships to homeland, kin, seasons, responsibilities, and cultural meaning. Learning that a partially buried lodge moderated winter temperatures is valuable. Pretending that the knowledge is merely a clever hack discovered by modern curiosity removes the community that sustained it. There is a similar danger in romanticizing caves as natural homes. A cave can seem more authentic than a constructed lodge because it appears ancient and untouched. In reality, the Earth Lodge better demonstrates human control. Its floor, frame, covering, entrance, and hearth were shaped to meet household needs. The cave offered a ready-made form, but it demanded compromise. The built shelter shows that Modoc families did not simply accept whatever nature provided. They altered materials and space through careful design. That comparison returns us to warmth from a different direction. The cave moderated exposure when its shape happened to help. The Earth Lodge was deliberately made to do so. One relied more heavily on choosing the right existing conditions, the other created favorable conditions through construction and maintenance. Both required knowledge, but they placed labor at different points. In the cave, more judgment was spent selecting and adapting a place. In the lodge, more labor was invested beforehand, so winter nights became more predictable. Predictability is an overlooked form of comfort. A familiar lodge allowed people to know where smoke would rise, where drafts entered, where food was stored, and where each person could rest. A cave might offer equal or better protection from one gust of wind while remaining uncertain in every other respect. During emergency refuge, uncertainty could be accepted. For long winter residents, the ability to anticipate tomorrow mattered as much as tonight's temperature. This may be the clearest answer to why volcanic caves did not replace ordinary winter villages. The caves were part of the homeland's shelter system, but they were not the center of it. They could interrupt exposure, conceal people, protect supplies, or buy time. Earth lodges joined warmth to water, food storage, kin networks, and repeated daily work. One was often a refuge within the landscape. The other was a household arranged for the season. As the final night of this story approaches, the distinction remains visible at the threshold. Outside the cave, frost outlines the basalt. Inside, the temperature changes slowly, and the darkness conceals both safety and risk. Somewhere beyond, the imagined Earth Lodge sits lower in the ground, its entrance known, its mats repaired, its hearth placed by design. The last question is no longer which shelter was warmer. It is what had to remain connected for warmth to last after the fire itself had gone low. What had to remain connected was larger than the fire. The ember at the center of a lodge could fade almost to darkness and still leave a little warmth beneath ash. Earth around the walls slowed the outside cold. Tule mats reduced drafts and separated bodies from the floor. Fur robes held warmth close. Food eaten earlier supplied the body with energy to make more. Someone awake noticed when a covering slipped, or a child moved toward the colder edge. No single part was enough. Warmth lasted because each part supported the next. A cave worked by the same rule, though with less certainty. Stone could interrupt the wind, and the deeper air might change more slowly than the weather outside. A dry shelf could protect bedding, a narrow entrance could reduce exposure. But the cave supplied no mat, no robe, no fuel, no water, and no judgment. Its contribution was passive. Human work had to complete what the rock began. By the hour before dawn, that difference became clearest. The fire was at its weakest. Fuel saved for morning mattered more than a brief blaze in the middle of the night. Bodies had been still for hours, producing less heat through movement. Dampness had had time to spread. Cold air had settled wherever the floor allowed it. A shelter that seemed adequate at dusk revealed its true character when the night had taken everything easy from it. In a familiar earth lodge, people could anticipate that hour. The structure had been built around repeated nights, sleeping places, the hearth, the entrance, stored materials, and the roof opening belonged to a pattern already tested. Even repairs had a history. A patch of earth or matting did not need to be understood from the beginning each time the weather changed. The lodge remembered through its design. A temporary cave shelter had no such memory until people brought it. The first night taught where smoke gathered. Another visit might reveal which ledge stayed dry or where frost reached after a clear night. Repeated use could turn an anonymous opening into a known place. But that knowledge remained vulnerable. If the people who held it died, were removed, or lost access to the land, the cave did not preserve the instructions for them. This is why the final cost of displacement cannot be measured only in miles. Removal separated families from a landscape that acted as an external memory. A bend in a route reminded someone where the wind changed. A familiar marsh signaled food and building material. A cave entrance carried warnings that might never have needed formal words. The land helped people remember, because each place prompted the knowledge attached to it. Far from that homeland, memory had to work without those prompts. Stories and teachings could continue, but the daily correction of the ground was missing. A child could hear that a certain cave trapped cold without standing at its entrance and feeling the air descend. A lodge form could be remembered without access to the same tule, soils, wood, or seasonal routine. Culture endured, but endurance took place under a new burden. Knowledge had to survive after the world that once answered it had been placed out of reach. The lava beds therefore hold two kinds of silence. One is natural. It belongs to dark passages, slow air, and stone that changes temperature without explanation. The other is historical. It belongs to domestic lives recorded only at the edges of war reports, to women and children present in the stronghold but rarely described in the detail given to soldiers, and to practical instructions that may have remained within families rather than entering public archives. Neither silence should be filled carelessly. The natural silence does not prove hidden heat. The historical silence does not grant permission to invent a perfect household scene. What can be said is quieter and stronger. Modoc families possessed detailed knowledge of a volcanic homeland. They built earth and mat lodges suited to seasonal life. They used fire, robes, tule, stored food, social cooperation, and careful judgment to manage cold. Volcanic shelters could assist that system, especially as refuge, but they did not replace it. The word assist carries more truth than the word provide. The cave assisted by stopping wind. Earth assisted by slowing temperature change. A robe assisted by holding body heat. Food assisted by fueling the body. Relatives assisted by sharing labour. Warning and care. Warmth was not a substance discovered beneath the basalt. It was an outcome produced between people, materials, and place. That outcome could be remarkably effective without ever becoming comfortable by modern standards. A family did not need the shelter to feel warm everywhere. It needed the most vulnerable people to remain safe, bedding to stay dry enough, smoke to remain tolerable, and fuel to last until movement and daylight returned. Success might mean waking cold but able to work. It might mean frost outside while water, food, and sleeping bodies inside had not frozen. Survival often occupied the narrow distance between discomfort and damage. At first light, that narrow distance became visible. A lodge entrance opened toward a pale winter landscape. Cold air entered, but so did information. The sky revealed weather. Tracks showed movement. The condition of stored wood could be checked. Water and food work began again. The shelter released people back into the network that sustained it. A cave entrance offered the same light with a different edge. The outer rock brightened while the deeper chamber remained grey. Frost marked the ground where the night air had reached. Smoke stains above an old hearth showed that people once made a small climate within the stone. They did not reveal how long the fire burned, whose hands fed it, or who received the warmest place. The evidence stops exactly where family care begins. Perhaps that is where this story should remain. Not inside a glowing underground room, because no such certainty is supported. Not on a dramatic image of people conquering winter, because the cold was managed rather than defeated. The most honest place is the threshold, where several truths meet. Volcanic rock can shelter and chill. A cave can protect and confine. Knowledge can endure and still be wounded by removal. A low fire can matter enormously without being the main source of survival. Morning reaches the frost first. A thin white line lies across the cave entrance, almost where the outside night ends and the slower darkness begins. Beyond it, the stone holds no secret furnace. It holds only the last trace of a carefully tended fire, the memory of bodies once gathered away from the wind, and the unanswered knowledge of exactly where a Modoc family knew it was safe to rest.